All right, here we are going to try to get some listeners to work. In other words, we want to be able to respond to either clicking a button or respond to a mouse click or respond to a key press. Today we're just going to do if you click a button, and there's lots of different listeners. Today we're just going to do a button listener. So how do we get a button on the screen and get it to listen? I put all the code in a new class called ball panel. Ball is still the same. My frame is still the same. I just made a different one here. So it took out a lot of the stuff I had in the previous videos. So now this is just the balls bouncing around. So if I run this real quick, they should be bouncing all over, but mine are just bouncing left and right. It's got 10 balls bouncing, actually 11, because one of them isn't part of the array. This little magenta one right there is not part of the array, but the rest of them are all part of the array. They're bouncing around. My goal today is to be able to add a button that when I click the button, it will create more balls. So I just want a button listener, and we can do anything with a button, but we're going to find out how to react to clicking a button today. All right, so we're going to go into our ball panel class, or your ball panel class. Mine's called ball panel 2. You can just leave yours as ball panel. All right, first thing we have to do is create a J button. So we're going to make a J button. We'll call it button equals, actually we'll just declare it just like we have been forever. Just declare a variable that's a type of J button called button. Call it whatever we want. And then in here we'll actually create the object of the J button class. Actually, it doesn't matter where we do it inside the constructor. I'll do it after we create the balls. I don't know why I was putting it there. So let's go down here. Doesn't matter. We're still inside the constructor. So we're going to say button equals new J button. So we're creating an object. What we were doing before is just declaring it. Now we're actually creating the object. We could go to the API and see the J button class allows us to pass a string, and we could say click me or click to add or something. I don't know. Click to add a ball, or we could write whatever we want on the button. That's just the text that will show up on the button. So first we have to declare the button, then we created the button, and then the next thing we need to do is add the button to the panel somehow. So we got to add it to the panel. It doesn't really matter the order of this as well, so I'm just going to put down here add button. Now, when I put the word add here, just to kind of understand Java a little bit, add is a method. Since I didn't put anything in front of add must be in this current class that we're currently in, but it's not in this class that we're currently in. So how am I calling a method that's in this class without using an object out in front is because we are children, or we're extending the JPanel class. So if we're extending the JPanel class, then we inherit all the methods from the JPanel, which inherits it from above it, which inherits from above it. So there is a add method somewhere in our tree. So we inherited it, and it accepts a component, so I pass it button. We'll see what happens. So all I did is declare a button, initialize a J button, and then add it to the panel. And by adding it to the panel, I just say in the paint component method, I just say add, and I put the component. Let's just see if that works. See if we get it on the screen. And because we didn't set the layout, we just said add it. It should add it as a flow layout. So it should add it right up here at the top in the middle. And I don't know why this happens sometimes. Sometimes you have to refresh the screen or resize the screen for the button to show up. So if I refresh it, it shows up. Sometimes it just works. Sometimes it doesn't. I haven't figured out why. So if you do this and your button doesn't show up, just kind of, change the size of the frame and then the button refreshes and it shows up. I have no idea why. I got to figure that out. All right, if I click the button, nothing happens because I haven't added a listener. In Java, an event that happens to a component, you can add listeners to. It's different in every language, but today we're going to learn how to add a listener to that button and do something. So when I click it, I want to add a button to or a ball to the screen. So I'll go back to it. There are always 3 steps to adding a listener. Okay, so the first step is you have to add the listener to the action. So right here, I like to do it right after I create the button. So here I am creating the component, because this works for JText fields, it works for anything. So you create the component, and then what I like to do right after it is add the listener. Now there are different types of listeners. So I'm going to say add action listener. Like if I control space, it should give me, there it is, add action listener. And it gives me a little bit about it. It says you need to pass it an action listener that they're going to call L. It tells us what it is. L is the action listener to be added. All right, an action listener, you can write this down, pause it, whatever you need to do, is any sort of action performed on a component. So buttons have action listeners. So I'm going to click on that one. However, it said you needed to pass it an action listener. I don't know what an action listener is, so I'm going to go to the API real quick. So I run to the API. I'm going to do a search, so either Command F or Control F for JPanel. Oh no, J button, because that's what I was using to add this action listener. J button. I'm I'm going to go to the JButton class. I'm going to look at all the methods of the JButton class, and I'm looking for a method called addActionListener because I just called it. Well, if I look in this short list, I'll see that there is not an addActionListener method here, and I'm like, huh. Well, that means maybe I inherit it. So if you look right above it, so I inherit from AbstractButton and all these, I inherit all of these methods. Well, one level above me in AbstractButton, there is a method called addActionListener. So that must be the one that I'm calling right now. And addActionListener, ooh, I don't like this, so I got to show you this too. I'm going to hit the back button. Oh boy, go back to methods. All right, before I click on addActionListener, this is what I discovered as I'm going through the API. I got to get rid of my search window, or as soon as I click on something, it keeps searching for JButton and takes me to the JButton place of this, but I'm done with JButton. So once you find what you're looking for, go ahead and close out that window. So now if I click on addActionListener, it'll take me to that method directly. Here it is, addActionListener, and it says you need to pass it an action listener, which we already knew. So now I'm going to click on ActionListener. And says, all right, what is ActionListener? Now, this is the first time we've introduced this. It's an interface. We've had abstract class. Well, I don't even know if we've had abstract classes. Most of the things we had are called classes. This is an interface. So this is our first introduction to interfaces. Interfaces are like fake classes in Java. They're just like placeholders over on the side, and they have no constructors. We'll eventually go through this. No methods, or excuse me, no method that do anything. They don't even have variables. So that really what they have is a bunch of methods that have no code to them. And if you decide that you want to use this action listener, you have to write the code for that method, or you have to override that method. So if I look at the action listener interface, since I know it's an interface, it must have some methods that I have to override. So I'm going to click on the methods, and there's only one method in here called actionPerformed. Now, usually when you inherit from a class, you have the option to override the methods you inherit, or you could just inherit them. But the difference in an interface, you don't have the option to override it. You have to override the methods that you're inheriting or using or whatever you want to call it. So I have to write this code for this method, and it has to have the exact same signature. So I have to write a method that looks exactly like this. So I'm actually going to copy this and bring it over to my class. And I'm going to have to write that. All right. So I'm going to leave this blank right now because I don't even know how the heck, like I have to, you think you're going to say, well, let's do this. New action listener. And this is something you need to know. You cannot create an object of an interface. So it's impossible to do what I'm doing right now. This is illegal. So we can't do that. So we can't create an object of the action listener class. So what do? We're going to write our own class. Now this is the first time all listeners in Java are inner classes. So we're going to run to the bottom of this class. This curly brace is ending the class. This is ending the paint component method. So I still need to be in the class, but outside of any methods. And I'm going to write my own class. So public class. I'm going to call it my action listener. This is an inner class. Okay. An inner class is a class that's inside of a class. We're currently inside the class. All listeners are always inner classes. Public class, and we're going to implement action listener. All right. What that means is we are now conforming to the protocol of the action listener interface in Java. Our class is, and we are going to then have to. So I'm going to start a curly brace and a curly brace. We're going to have to write the code for that method that I copied. So I'm going to control V that method in here. I'm going to make it public. It didn't put public out in front of it. So this method is in the action listener interface, and I am currently overriding it because I have to, because action listener is an interface. Since action listener is an interface, and I'm implementing that interface in my class, so I'm writing my own class inside of this class. I know this is nuts, but all listeners are inner classes. I have to write this method. All right. I'm going to start my curly brace and then my curly brace. Whatever I put in here is what it will do when the action is performed. So when an action is performed, this is what I want it to do. When somebody clicks the button, this is what I want it to do. Well, I want to add to that array. So I'm going to say balls.add, and I'm going to say new ball. And that is just a quick way to add a ball to the array. If I add a ball to the array, it'll then loop through the draw method, the move, the bounce, it'll start doing it. So this is adding a ball to the array every time they click the button. I could do anything I want in here. I could put 5,000 lines of code in here. I put one. I'm just going to add a ball to the array using my default constructor. All right, step one, add the action listener. Step two, write the inner class that we did right here. We are currently writing the inner class, and then the third step is write all the methods that you need to write, which in this case was the one method action performed. All right, now if I go back up where I added the listener, I have to put I put in here new action listener before, but that is illegal. Like if I try to compile this right now, it's going to say, well, let's see what it says. If I try to compile it, it says it's abstract, cannot be instantiated. It's actually it's abstract because it's an interface. So you can't, instantiated means build an object. We can't build an object of that interface in Java. However, I can build an object of my class that implements that interface. And I just wrote a class down here called myActionListener that implements ActionListener. So what I'm going to do then is build an object of my class. Now, I didn't write a constructor for my class, so that means that there is a default constructor. So I'm going to try to compile this now, and it says I'm the best. So I added the component, I added the listener to the component, and then I actually wrote the code for that listener down here, and I wrote the method for it there. This is crazy, 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 but it compiled. Let's give it a whirl. Let's try to run this sucker. Oh, this time the add button just showed up. I don't know why, but if I click, if you notice every time I click, a new ball gets added. You see balls showing up every time I'm clicking, a new ball is getting added to the screen. You could put print statements in there to see if it is working, but that is working. That's our first one. That's an action listener. Again, see if we can go through the steps again. We created the button, or we declared the button. We then built the button. We then added, well, the third step we did is we added the button to the screen. This is adding the button to the panel, which is done in Paint Component. The other stuff is done in the constructor. And then we added the action listener. This was the really crazy part right here. So once we create the component, we attach a listener to it. Listeners are always your own classes or inner classes that you write. So since the add action listener method said I needed to pass an action listener, I wrote a class down here that implements action listener. And this is how you use interfaces in Java. You use the word implements. So action listener is an interface in Java. I am implementing that interface, and the only method in that interface is action performed. So since it's an interface, I am forced to write the code for this method. It's not, you're overriding it, but you're forced to override it. Has to have the exact same signature. And then whatever you put in here is what you want to do when the action is performed. Hopefully that works for you. If not, we'll go over it in class, but that's our first action listener.